what he calls a common point of view as a shared moral perspective from which we establish a general system of conduct and behavior. As we converse together or debate about the character traits that tend to produce actions of which we either approve or blame, we also establish what Hume calls a general standard of virtue that reflects our preferences regarding useful character traits and to which our own moral sentiments should conform. The moral sentiments and the principle of humanity on which they depend are the same in all of us, social and universal, a phrase I'll be repeating. And so despite appearing, quote, at first sight, somewhat small and delicate, end quote, they instead help us to unite and form the party of humankind against vice or disorder, its common enemy. In this presentation, I can consider in greater depth Hume's intriguing suggestion that we ourselves come to form in a manner the party of humankind. In what sense do we come to recognize and value our shared human nature? How should we understand the implications of Hume's argument for the worth of humankind? Does he intend the party of humankind as an ideal to which we might aspire, something like Kant's kingdom of ends? Or is it a value-laden description of how we actually participate together as moral evaluators of character and conduct and endorsers of the value of morality itself? To understand better the notion of the party of humankind and answer the questions I just posed, I will reconstruct how Hume sets about accomplishing what I take to be the central task of the inquiry, namely to establish that the principle of humanity comprises the foundation of morality. Hume's objective in doing this is twofold. First, to show that the principle of humanity is the source of our most authoritative moral sentiments. And second, to argue that our sense of humanity can acquire the force to counter other sentiments or motives grounded in either self-love or partiality. Force is Hume's term, and I shall show that it is a crucial explanatory concept in his use of an experimental method in the inquiry. So I'll proceed as follows. First, I begin with Hume's use of the term force and relatedly vivacity and liveliness in the treatise and the relevance of it to his particular use of an experimental method in that work. I can then show that Hume works with quite different notions of force in the inquiry, and he appeals to force to establish the principle of humanity as the foundation of morality. From there, we can examine how our sense of humanity acquires force, and that will bring us to our role in the party of humankind. Because the experimental method is based on experience and observation, Hume is also in a position to undermine three competing philosophical views: moral rationalism, the skeptical or selfish theory, and Hutchisonian moral sense theory. So let's begin by looking briefly at Hume's appeals to force in the treatise and connect them to his experimental method there. The first sense, which is introduced in the second sentence of the first section of Book 1, has to do with a key difference between basic perceptions, impressions, and ideas, and how we experience the way in which they arise in the mind, how they strike the mind or enter into our awareness as thought. Thus, Hume writes, those perceptions which enter with most force and violence we may name impressions, and under this name I comprehend all our sensations, passions, and emotions. The more forceful, lively, or vivacious perceptions contrast with ideas, which are initially described as the faint images or copies of impressions. The difference in the force of impressions in comparisons with the ideas is one of degree. The force and vivacity of impressions, in contrast to ideas, comprises a methodological starting point for Hume. A second sense of force invokes the principles of association, which are first introduced as universal mental principles that guide the imagination in uniting ideas together to form complex ideas. A uniting principle, such as resemblance, contiguity, or causation, is, quote, a gentle force which commonly prevails, so that human minds naturally form complex ideas and trains of thought. The principles of association also have a key role in the production of both belief and our sympathetically acquired passions, in both cases infusing ideas with the force and liveliness transmitted by either custom or sympathy. Hume's experimental method and the role of the principles of association is on full display in the first two parts of Book 2, which concern the passions. And really those first two parts are set out as an extended series of experiments, an experimental method. So Hume begins with the phenomena, that of our experience of pride, for example, a feeling of confidence, and begins to make theoretically refined observations regarding the object of pride as the self, the constituents of the cause of pride, namely the quality, beauty, which causes pleasure, and the subject in which it inheres, my house. Hume regards the object and the subject and the quality of the causes of pride as facts that he has established about the passion of pride. The numerous occasioning causes of pride, beauty and possessions and so on, cannot be original, since that would require a monstrous heap of mental principles. So Hume adjusts his strategy. He turns to a Copernican strategy that allows him to reduce the number of explanatory principles in play. Turning to examine how the mind works, in particular, in terms of the association of ideas and a similar association between resembling impressions, yields a common explanation for how the various causes produce pride. Hume introduces a causal hypothesis that relies on two suppositions, namely that all causes of pride cause a pleasure independent of the pleasure of pride, and that all causes of pride are related to the proud person. In comparing the properties introduced by supposition with those that have been established as fact, Hume arrives at a system that explains the origin of pride, namely a double relation of ideas and impressions, a double relation that produces a double impulse that produces an experience of pride. Hume's radically innovative argument explains pride's origin in terms of efficient causation and in effect sidelines any role for final causes. Hume deploys a similar associationist strategy, invoking sympathy, to explain both the production and correction of our moral sentiments. But when he recasts Book 3 of the treatise as the inquiry, he abandons this kind of explanation. The experimental method in the later work has a new focus. In the inquiry, Hume ascribes force to the utility of things and persons, and to two principles of human nature, namely self-love and humanity. Although Hume mentions twice the association of ideas, this work considerably downplays the principles of association that had such a prominent role in the treatise. As we'll see in more detail below, in the inquiry, the force of utility lies in how it commands our esteem or admiration. And with respect to the principles of human nature, the natural and extensive energy of self-love keeps our attention on ourselves and our needs and drives us to satisfy those needs and desires. But despite the force of self-love, our sense of humanity, which gives us a felt concern for others, acquires force through the social pressures to which our natural sociability makes us susceptible, so that our sense of humanity can counter self-love. Now, while Hume might appear to use the terms energy and force figuratively when speaking of self-love and humanity, the notion of a drive in psychology appears to capture what Hume has in mind. while the need to satisfy the demands of self-love, of both basic and refined physiological and emotional needs and desires, evidently fits the profile of a drive, Hume builds the case for the greater force of humanity due to those circumstances in which we can exercise our sympathetic concern for others and have a care for how others regard us. As Gilles Deleuze has pointed out with respect to Humean drives, whether for self-preservation, self-liking, or connection with others, drives only get realized in the context of institutional arrangements. It thus matters, as Hume shows in his essays on politics and political economy, what kind of institutions are available and whether our drives and needs are satisfied constructively or destructively. So let's look at Hume's starting point in the inquiry. His argument in sections 2 through 9 focuses on constructing the catalog of qualities that make up what he calls personal merit in order to discover the common circumstances, and this will then help in establishing the foundation of morality. Yet the argument also targets three opposing views. While he advises that we simply ignore the disingenuous disputants who have denied the reality of moral distinctions, Hume challenges the arguments of the moral skeptic and especially of the selfish theorists, particularly in sections 5, 6, 9, and Appendix 2. The rationalist view, view that reason alone discerns moral distinctions such as right and wrong, or virtue and vice, comprises Hume's second target, although rationalism is now receding into the background, and the arguments against reason are relegated to the first appendix. Moreover, since reason and sentiment are apt to concur in almost all moral determinations and conclusions, Hume makes space in two distinct ways for an essential role for reasoning, both in our evaluations and deliberations, and also in exercising our sense of humanity. A third target is Francis Hutcheson's moral sense view. Hume denies that we have a unique moral sense that functions to approve of various forms of benevolence. For Hume, a general benevolence is sympathy or humanity, a felt concern, but not a motivating desire for the well-being of others. And I shall argue that a sense of humanity lends authority to our praise of useful mental qualities over pernicious ones, so that Hutcheson's emphasis on benevolence is downplayed by Hume. Hume's method begins with an examination of our moral vocabulary to see whether the terms we use for the qualities that make up personal merit can help us to discover circumstances common to the virtues. The terms that we use have both some descriptive content, for example, courage signals bravery and confidence, and convey some form of praise, esteem, or admiration. Reason helps us to find the common circumstances in which the estimable qualities agree and those that unite the blamable qualities. The foundation of ethics will be revealed when we can find and explain those universal principles from which all censure or approbation is ultimately derived. And Hume writes, we can only expect success by following the experimental method and deducing general maxims from a comparison of particular instances. So Hume begins with the social virtues of benevolence and justice. And while it might seem a superfluous task to prove that benevolence earns our esteem, Hume's aim is to reveal why qualities as sociability, humanity, mercy, gratitude, generosity, and so on elicit our moral approval. Our own experience shows us that benevolent characters tend to increase the happiness and well-being of society, whether for those within a person's narrower sphere or for a larger share of mankind. In other words, the benevolent social virtues are useful to others and to society generally, so we may conclude that utility forms at least a part of their merit and is one source of our approbation of them. There are many things that we regard as useful and benevolent. beneficial, including parts of nature, our artifacts, our professional labor, and they earn from us some form of praise, if not moral praise. Experience also shows us that in all determinations of morality, this circumstance is ever principally in view, even if we don't acknowledge it. Indeed, when we adjust the boundaries of moral good and evil based on our experience of whether particular actions or practices continue to serve society's interests, we are doing so on the basis of utility. When he turns to justice, rather than focusing on the various virtues of justice, fidelity, veracity, honesty, and so forth, as he did with benevolence, Hume instead shifts his focus to the circumstances that make justice both possible and necessary for us. Why does he do this? He set out to persuade us that in promoting the well-being of others, the benevolent qualities prove to be useful. Given the standing of justice as a social virtue and the evident benefit of the rules of justice, it's superfluous to show that justice is valued, at least in part, for its utility. So the questions to ask regarding justice are whether public utility is the sole origin of justice, and whether our reflections on the beneficial qualities of justice are the sole foundations of its merit. So Hume's argument sets out the unique circumstances of human beings, both our nature and our material conditions, that make justice both useful and possible for us, and indeed entirely necessary to the support of society. Since rules or conventions of justice are absolutely necessary for the support of society, Hume's survey of the circumstances establishes its sole origin in public utility. The rules of justice depend on our particular situation and arise from the utility resulting to society. So taking these considerations together, we can conclude that justice derives its usefulness to the public, and hence alone arises its merit and obligation. Now, as I said, in the inquiry, Hume appeals to the notions of force and energy in new ways. Given that part of the merit of benevolence is derived from its beneficial tendencies or usefulness, the utility of benevolence, Hume claims, exerts, quote, a command over our esteem and approbation. So utility has a kind of psychological force with us. We respond to what we deem useful. Hume explicitly connects this circumstance of usefulness and its commanding of our favor with its force and energy. For example, reminding us of the disorder that would result from the absence of justice, and hence the necessity of its public utility, he writes that, quote, we have attained a knowledge of the force of that principle here insisted on. The necessity of justice to the support of society is the sole foundation of that virtue. And since no moral excellence is more highly esteemed, we may conclude that this circumstance of usefulness has, in general, the strongest energy and the most entire command over our sentiments. So utility comprises the circumstance shared by both the virtues of benevolence and those of justice. It is consistent with the experimental method, or, quote, the rules of philosophy and even of common reason, where any principle has been found to have a great force and energy in one instance, to ascribe to it a like energy in all similar instances. This indeed is Newton's chief rule of philosophizing, end quote. So utility commands our favor, and Hume presumptively regards this favoring of utility as a general moral approval. So his task is to then ground it as the basis for moral approval. So we might regard utility as a general descriptor of the good-making features of the social virtues. When we approve of someone's beneficence, we don't typically think of her action as useful. We think of her as meritorious and praiseworthy because she acts from a disposition that tends to enhance the well-being of others through acts of compassion or friendship. We esteem the just person similarly for her honesty or loyalty. But we can mark a difference between justice and benevolence. Benevolence is a direct tendency or instinct that produces a good in itself, complete and entire, while the benefit of justice derives not from the individual act, but from the whole system, laws, policies, courts, governments, and the inflexible rules of justice. But Hume's point is that both benevolence and justice have useful tendencies insofar as they promote the interests of society or others. So useful serves as a general description of the feature that makes meritorious both kinds of social virtues. The move from particular instances to this more general feature that unites different kinds of particulars advances the case for establishing the foundation of morality. Utility unifies a variety of virtues, including, in section 6, the self-regarding useful virtues. So let's turn now to establishing humanity as the foundation of morality. Utility seems to have salience for us in a psychological way, commanding our favor. The social virtues are useful insofar as they promote some beneficial end. So that end, quote, must please either from considerations of self-interest or from more generous motives and regard. The argument of section 5 centers on finding the source of our approval of utility in sympathy and humanity rather than self-love. This argument has an echo in section 9, where self-love continues to have force, but lacks the proper direction required for the foundation of morals. In common life, we have no qualms about giving praise to useful things, ships and buildings and social virtues, but moral philosophers are reluctant to make utility central. Perhaps Hume hypothesizes because, except for the skeptics and selfish theorists, they found it difficult to account for the influence that utility has on our praise. And of course, Hume's focus on utility was the source of many of the critical reviews that he got when the inquiry came out. Now, Hume acknowledges that self-interest or self-love has what he describes as an extensive energy that directs us to consider personal utility in both our evaluations and deliberations. To counter the selfish theory, at this point in his argument, Hume emphasizes the disinterested nature of much of our approval or blame. Both experience and reflection on our own judgments show that we approve of meritorious characters and actions, such as those from long ago or far away, that have no bearing on our own interest or happiness. So if the usefulness of the social virtues is not always considered with reference to ourselves, and we're not indifferent to the interests of others or society, then another more social affection must count in great part for the origin of morality. Sympathy is that more social affection. In the inquiry, Hume uses a number of terms in addition to sympathy. He invokes the principle or sentiment of humanity, the benevolent principle, fellow feeling, and social sympathy. I think that these have shades of different meanings, but the reference to general benevolence or fellow feeling has been taken by many to indicate that Hume moves closer to a Hutchisonian or moral sense position. A note in the second appendix might seem to lend plausibility to the Hutchisonian reading. But while Hume distinguishes between two kinds of benevolence, general and particular, as Hutcheson did, particular benevolence is founded on particular connections, relationships with others, and motivates us to promote others' well-being or alleviate their misery. But in contrast, general benevolence is a general sympathy with others' pains and pleasures. Hume writes that the sentiment of, quote, general benevolence or humanity or sympathy, we shall treat more fully in the course of this inquiry. So Hutcheson had also distinguished between general and particular benevolence, as well as between different kinds of calm public desires. And in each case, they're all desires that aim at the good of a species or system. And the moral sense, for Hutcheson, approves of how, in particular, universal calm benevolence can restrain particular desires, and how universal benevolence aims at promoting the greater good. And Hutcheson uses that claim about universal benevolence or calm general benevolence to derive our ideas of rights, since rights and corresponding obligations secure or further the general good. Hume does not present his notion of general benevolence as any kind of desire, but rather just a general sympathy with another, or a compassion for his pains and a congratulations with his pleasures. It thus more resembles what Hutcheson calls the public sense or sympathy, which produces pleasure in us when we observe the happiness of others, or pain on observing their misery. Hume explicitly states that this general benevolence or sympathy might be insufficient to move us to act on anyone's behalf, but will at least produce a cool preference for the useful over the pernicious. His distinction between particular and general benevolence thus marks a contrast between the various benevolent motives that prompt us to act on behalf of others and a general sympathetic concern for the happiness or misery of others. Hume continues to maintain, as he did in the treatise, we do not have a love of mankind as such. Indeed, it's in part because of the limits of benevolence that we need the cautious, jealous virtue of justice. Justice is useful, indeed necessary, and its useful tendencies are favored by our sense of humanity. The family of terms that used to characterize sympathy has significance for the distinction Hume wishes to emphasize in the inquiry between the useful and the immediately agreeable virtues. Hume appeals to social sympathy to explain our approbation of the immediately agreeable virtues, but he reserves the use of the term humanity as a principle that directs our praise or blame towards those mental qualities with useful or harmful tendencies. So humanity, I take it, has a kind of technical sense for Hume. In contrast, social sympathy often takes the form of contagion. In sections 7 and 8, for example, Hume describes our being struck or seized by what is immediately agreeable to a person. The sublimity of courage, for example, the charm and kindliness of benevolence. Sympathy operates, this social sympathy operates immediately without any reflection on the tendencies of the traits we admire or detest, and is not morally discerning in the way that humanity is. We should note that Hume finds popular sedition, party zeal, and factions among the less laudable effects of social sympathy in human nature. Significantly, we find no reference to the principle or sentiment of humanity when Hume is discussing the immediately agreeable mental qualities, or similarly, various personal advantages such as wealth, power, or strength. That there, it's the social sympathy that's doing the work of producing our admiration. So in sections 5, 6, and 9, we can see that Hume is giving a specific sense to the principle or sentiment of humanity as a particular reason-informed and reflective form of sympathy, and the source of our praise and blame on those mental qualities with useful or pernicious tendencies. The evidence shows that sympathy gives us an interest in our fellow human beings, and as a specific form of sympathy, the principle of humanity gives us a concern for others' happiness or misery insofar as they are affected by the social virtues with the useful tendencies or by vices with harmful ones. Hume recognizes that humanity can take weak and more robust forms, for example, depending on a person's temperament. A person who lacks humanity due to a cold insensibility or a narrow selfishness of temper must be equally indifferent to virtue or vice, except for insofar as they affect him. In contrast, a person with a warm concern for the interest of our species is attended with a delicate feeling of all moral distinctions. She's more discerning. She has a stronger resentment of injury done to others and a lively approbation for their welfare. Most of us will lie somewhere on a continuum between cold indifference and a warm concern. We will unavoidably feel some propensity to the good of mankind and make it an object of choice where everything's equal. Those who have a genuine interest in their fellow persons will have a more delicate taste, similar to the taste in Hume's essay on the standard of taste, that gives them a great superiority in perceiving distinctions of moral good and evil. In section 6, Hume explicitly makes humanity the foundation of morality. In considering someone's preferences, and this is a quote from section 6, paragraph 5, quote, "Where everything is equal, and however cool his choice may be, if his heart be selfish, or if the persons interested be remote from him, there must still be a choice or distinction between what is useful or pernicious. This distinction made by humanity is the same in all its parts with the moral distinction, whose foundation has been so often and so much in vain inquired after. The same endowments of the mind in every circumstance are agreeable to the sentiment of morals and to that of humanity. The same temper is susceptible of high degrees of the one sentiment and of the other, and the same alteration in the objects by their nearer approach or connections enlivens the one and the other. So by all the rules of philosophy, including natural philosophy, we must therefore conclude that these sentiments are originally the same, humanity and moral, since in each particular, even the most minute, they are governed by the same laws and are moved by the same objects. That the sentiments of humanity are the same as the moral sentiments establishes humanity as the foundation of morality. Mental qualities useful to oneself or to others have the same effects as those of the social virtues on humanity and morality. That humanity and morality are the same principle must, quote, bring as strong conviction as in moral as in natural disquisitions, end quote. For example, about the different effects of the same principle of gravity that keeps the moon in its orbit and makes objects fall when near to the Earth's surface. The argument in the first part of section 9 affirms humanity as the origin of morals, drawing a contrast between humanity and self-love and emphasizing the force that humanity and the moral sentiments have. Morality is thus possible for us because we possess this principle or sentiment of humanity, and its favoring of general usefulness and disfavoring of general harmfulness gives us a clear distinction between humanity and self-love. This distinction shows up in the different vocabularies of the language of self-love and that of morality, with only the latter giving us the terms that express our universal sentiments of blame or praise. Hume thus implicitly denies the existence of an internal moral sense, the approvals are which are directed towards various forms of benevolence. So now I turn to look at the authority and force of humanity, in part because it is a reason-informed principle, and in part because it is also a social principle. The principles of humanity often have a role in our deliberation, choice, and action. And Hume goes into that in the first appendix, their role in deliberation. But if they do not have an influence there, they must, quote, at all times have some authority over our sentiments and give us a general approbation of what is useful to society and blame of what is dangerous or pernicious, end quote. Thus, the reality of the existence of the moral sentiments must be admitted in every theory or system. Hume appears to make a descriptive claim here about how our having a sense of humanity authorizes the moral sentiments of praise and blame. But there's a normative implication for which I'll now mount a case. We could draw a threefold distinction regarding our perspective on the useful or pernicious. Our assessment of utility can be from a private perspective driven by self-love, or from a social but partial perspective based on social sympathy, as we see in the case of political parties, or from a public and general view. And this last is the moral perspective of humanity. Hume acknowledges that we're not always selfish, but often join in causes with others because of the social sympathy. And this removes another obstacle to accepting that the moral sentiments are in fact social and universal. But in contrast to a social and partial point of view, the moral sentiments arising from humanity, quote, form in a manner the party of humankind against vice or disorder is common enemy. Because we establish our general preferences and hence a general standard of virtue from this shared moral perspective, the selfish passions, which may originally be stronger, can be overpowered by the force of these more social and public principles. So in addition to the concern for our fellow persons that it gives us, the other distinctive hallmark of the principle of humanity is its demand that good reasoning play a role. Let me emphasize this. For humanity to serve as the foundation of morality, it must be the principle of humanity assisted by reason. This is the sense in which reason and sentiment concur with respect to this class of moral distinctions and determinations. Hume signals the importance of this early on in section 1 with an analogy between natural or artistic beauty and moral beauty. Some responses to beauty are immediate. He says, some species of beauty, especially the natural kinds, on their first appearance, command our affection and approbation, but here reason and argument typically fail to change our response from the one that we naturally have. But, quote, in many orders of beauty, particularly those of the finer arts, it's necessary to employ much reasoning to feel the proper sentiment, and a false relish may frequently be corrected by argument and reflection. End quote. The agreeable mental qualities that immediately strike, dazzle, or charm us are like the natural beauties, and our approval just emanates from our social sympathy. Hume cautions against an unreflective identification with some of the immediately agreeable qualities, such as heroic courage, and also cautions against blindly participating in the zeal of factions. As a form of moral beauty, our assessment of useful and pernicious qualities, quote, demands the assistance of our intellectual faculties in order to give it a suitable influence on the human mind, end quote. As I noted above, I take Hume to be using the term humanity when it indicates the principle or sentiment of humanity rather than a benevolent motive in a restricted sense. Despite a shared origin in social sympathy, humanity differs both in its object and its operation from the contagious and unreflective responses to the immediately agreeable or disagreeable aspects of mental qualities. In our conversations, debates, negotiations, as we try to arrive at shared responses to the useful or harmful qualities of characters or policies and so on that affect our own or others' happiness, we acquire an awareness of the importance of accurately identifying and evaluating the tendencies of these qualities. Hence Hume's stress on the importance of conversation, of reasoning and feeling together, and of making ourselves intelligible to one another. Section 1 emphasizes this role for reasoning, the need for precise distinctions, accurate comparisons and analogies, the discerning and fixing of facts and drawing just conclusions. This reasoning paves the way in order to give humanity a proper discernment of its object. Humanity and its sentiments of praise and blame are not unreflective feelings. Really, to prefer happiness over harm requires that humanity is informed by reflection on experience, including history, and reasoning about the tendencies of qualities under various conditions and in relation to other qualities with which they might operate. As David Falk pointed out some decades ago, there's a logical motivation for separating merit from fact and taste from reason. Reason's task is to discover and establish the facts about the nature of things, while merit is a quality added by taste or humanity that has a reflexive dependence on what that quality is otherwise like. Or in Hume words, whether a quality has, on a comprehensive view, useful or harmful tendencies that in turn have the power to command our esteem or disfavor. This is what it is to gild or stain those objects which nature has revealed the nature of to us. From the perspective of humanity, these tendencies have a practical importance for us, what we are like or could be like, and how well or badly our lives go. Hume points to the need for this kind of reasoning with respect to the virtues of benevolence, where we may need to adjust our conduct in order appropriately to benefit others. The case for charitable giving that he considers, for example. And such reasoning can take place at the individual or a more collective level. For example, in policies regarding government assistance to those well off, particularly women and children. Here, good reasoning might take into account what the assistance is really in aid of, or what really counts as making lives better. According to Hume, this careful reasoning is particularly crucial in the case of justice. In addition to each person's regard for justice, a large part of it consists in various conventions and institutions, including laws and courts and government. And since the advantage of justice lies in its continued practice over time, Hume emphasizes that an accurate reason or judgment about law or policy requires the reasoned debates of legal theorists, as well as the precedents from history and public records. So our moral judgments are not conclusions or inferences from some set of facts, but rather a response to those facts. Our praise or blame consists in an active feeling or sentiment, given the evidence that reason has set before us. So while reason instructs us in the several tendencies of actions, we need humanity to favor and prefer those which are useful and beneficial. Hume suggests that these conversations or debates that we have together allow us to gain familiarity with the general preferences and distinctions that arise from the general interests of the community. And from this more general and shared perspective, we employ a moral discourse that contrasts with the language of self-love and allows us to make ourselves intelligible to one another. In a significant departure from the argument of the treatise, it's this communication of our shared sentiments from a shared point of view rather than sympathy with those affected by someone's characters that, quote, makes us form some general unalterable standard by which we may approve or disapprove of characters and manners, a standard that is founded chiefly on general usefulness. This collective sense of humanity contributes to its force. As humanity's force exerts authority over our moral sentiments, it can at the same time control self-love in our evaluation and deliberation. Because the shared moral point of view and moral language helps us to articulate our expectations of one another, we can find the universal principles of morality can control and limit the particular sentiments of self-love. I think it can also shape the appropriate forms that the various self-regarding passions can take. For example, something like ambition, right? We look for ways in which that can be realized constructively rather than destructively, because it is approved as such from the general point of view or common point of view. To the skeptic who might suppose it doubtful that we have a principle of humanity or concern for others, Hume points to the numerous instances where we freely approve of what tends to the interest of society, pointing to the force of the benevolent principle, since our approval signals our satisfaction with the end to which useful traits tend. He observes, it appears as an additional confirmation that these principles of humanity and sympathy enter so deeply into all our sentiments and have so powerful an influence as may enable them to excite the strongest censure and applause. So while the selfish passions may be originally stronger, they can be overpowered by the force and the authority of these social and public principles, because the latter are universal and comprehensive. When we survey the object from a moral perspective, it appears on due consideration and with reasoning and reflection the same to all, at least in principle, and we can strive to reach that consensus or convergence with one another through our conversations. So all characters come within the scope of the moral perspective. In addition, our love of fame is a part of our nature that gives a great addition of force to the moral sentiments or to humanity. Our earnest pursuit of a character, Hume writes, a name, a reputation in the world, requires us to regard ourselves as others do, so that we cultivate this constant habit of surveying ourselves, as it were, in reflection, and apply the moral sentiments to our own character and conduct. And Hume suggests here, again, intriguingly, that the cultivation of the sense of right and wrong and this self-surveying begets, he writes, in noble natures, a certain reverence for themselves as well as others, which is the surest guardian of every virtue, end quote. Hume's morality has thus emphasized the force of many sympathies in forming the party of humankind, as our own moral sentiments correspond with those of others or elicit similar sentiments in them. So just to conclude, taking human nature as it is, the cultivation of humanity, both in individuals and particular societies, reflects a collective moral achievement, and it can be a rather fragile moral achievement, as we know. Hume's view of the party of humankind thus suggests an ideal. From a shared moral perspective, we would ideally transcend social divisions to reason about and assess together the arrangements in society that aim at promoting well-being and alleviating the inevitable misery that we'll suffer as part of the human condition. But from a more realistic point of view, where party loyalties advocate competing conceptions of the public good, Hume's view, in conjunction with what he sets out in the essays, shows the importance of harnessing humanity to the decisions we make as we participate in social institutions, the economy, government, religion, education, and law, and so on. Hume's view, I think, also accommodates the darker side of our social reality, how societies or large groups of people within them fare badly when humanity is diminished or extinguished and selfish or partial factions govern. So in this sense, humanity must be cultivated and cherished so that we continue to give it the force to recognize and value our shared human nature. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jacqueline Taylor. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Today, as we all know, is a very special day. We are celebrating 20 years of Grupo Hume, founded by Lívia Guimarães, professor of the Federal University of Minas Gerais, who has changed and is continuously inspiring the lives of many of us, including myself. I'm delighted to be part of Grupo Hume's history and its legacy. And it is with great honor that we could listen to Professor Jacqueline Taylor's brilliant conference. Dr. Taylor is a professor of philosophy at the University of San Francisco for 18 years now. and has been the Hume Society's president from 2013 until May of this year. Professor Taylor received her PhD from the University of Chicago, and she provided us knowledge in the latest Hume studies with this brilliant presentation. Thank you very much, Professor Taylor. We would like to thank you for taking the time to be here with us today, commemorating this important day for Hume's research in Brazil. And thank you again, all of you, for being here with us. Now, if Professor Taylor is ready, we are open to receive questions by means of the YouTube chat or by Zoom. We are here. Marcos?
Well, first of all, thank you for the brilliant conference, really. It surely gave me a lot to think about. I have two questions. Should I make them both in a row?
Yes, I'm writing.
Okay. So the first one is about the concept of force. The way I see it, it's important since the first version of Hume's epistemology in book 1 of the treatise, we see it when it comes to transference of vivacity and on his treatment of probabilities. It's still really important in the inquiry concerning the principles of morals, as you showed. So my first question is, would you say that the concept of force is an important part of what allows us to devise some sort of unity along the whole of Hume's philosophy? And in which way? And my second question, which is actually about a personal obsession of mine, it seems to me that Hume gets really, really closer to Hutcheson in the second inquiry, to the point where we have a universal benevolence which seems to solve a lot of problems, but on the other hand is apparently a little less. So it allows less diversity than sympathy in the treatise would seem. So, taking that into account, what I would like to know is, how close exactly do you think he gets to Hutcheson? And, well, why did he do it?
Great, thank you so much. You know, Marcus, that's really interesting that your first question about the notion of force in the treatise and then in the inquiry, and you probably have made a better study of the first inquiry than I have in this regard, about whether it provides a unity with the whole of Hume's philosophy. And I think it does, and I think Hume means to use that as, right, it's a crucial component in the experimental method. And what I'm suggesting is that in the inquiry concerning the principles of morals, Hume switches to a different kind of force, a different sense of force, both the force of utility and you know, and as I said several times, that must be a kind of psychological thing when we see something useful, right? It attracts us, it appeals to us in some way psychologically. And then what he really wants to do, I believe, the sense in which the selfish theorist is really a key target in this work, is show the force of how humanity, if each of us has a small spark of humanity, it can gather force when we come together from the common point of view. And so the acquisition, and that's something that it can gain collectively in a way that selfishness can't, although factions can. So there's that, you know, that interesting third element there of partiality and factions. But I think in terms of the methodology, that what seems to be the same is the kind of Baconian, Bacon's method that is at work in both these works, right? When Bacon says, by induction, I don't mean mere enumeration. I mean looking at the particulars to find something general. In the case of the inquiry, it's the utility that unites different kinds of particular virtues. And in the treatise, what the passage that when I was looking at the production of pride, I think Hume's, and this I don't think is carried over, but the Copernican shift from examining the causes, or the elements, the constituents of the causes that produce pride, to then the workings of the human mind, right? That's this Copernican shift. That's change perspective, and now look at how this is affecting our mind. And I don't see that particular Copernican strategy carried over. That doesn't mean to say, right, because in the inquiry concerning human understanding, we definitely want to look at the contribution that the mind makes in terms of causality and so on. But Newton becomes more pronounced in the inquiry here. The explicit references, I think, force to the Newton's third rule of philosophizing, the section in section 6, the passage in section 6, which looks at, right, the utility of self-regarding, that it's the same principle as the gravity that keeps the moon in its orbit and makes objects fall to Earth. So there's more references to Newton. But I would just say that I think for me, it's important to look when Hume makes these references to natural philosophers or to natural philosophical elements such as force, to look closely at the particular context that he is making them in. So definitely it continues to be, I think your question was really interesting. Like, it continues to be a crucial element in experimental method for Hume. And it'd be really interesting to trace that out in greater detail, I think, and just consider that. As to your second question, yes, I see what you're saying. I think that Hume, why does he do this? You said, how close is he to Hutcheson, and why does he make this shift? And I think it's the reasoning is complicated. I think that Hume sees problems with the principles of association. And I have argued elsewhere that in particular, the way in which he invoked the principles of association and sympathy to produce the moral sentiments in the treatise was really problematic. And Hume really rethinks this whole thing. And you're right that the sympathy in the treatise was able to accommodate a huge amount of diverse phenomena, as you say. And by singling out this principle of humanity as a moral principle, Hume has backed off from that kind of the richness of what sympathy could do in the treatise. I mean, the part that I think is retained is, because for me, what sympathy in the treatise allows us to see is the way in which social and cultural meaning gets reproduced, right? Through sympathy, we take on whatever the values of our community are, including, the subcultures in which we participate. So it's a really rich thing. And so I think the social factions that Hume talks about that's referencing the kind of thing that sympathy could do in the treatise. But I think what Hume wants is humanity as rather than the kind of reflexive strategy he employed at the end of the treatise to show that we can reflect on the principles of our nature and see all is, great and good in the rise and origin of morality. He wants from the outset a moral principle, and that moral principle is humanity. It's very different from Hutcheson, I think, because of utility in part, right? What we approve of, well, that's not quite right. Utility, benevolence is beneficial by Hutcheson's lights too. Yeah, so I think that Hutcheson, though, what Hume is doing, right? Hume is arguing that the utility is the source of merit. That is what gives the thing that we approve merit. And humanity is a response to that merit. But it can't be just. So humanity isn't just, though, a moral sense that has an original tendency to approve of benevolence, because we have this range of virtues, self-regarding virtues. I mean, something like, if ambition is something that we can praise in certain formats, I mean, that has nothing to do with benevolence. And it's humanity that explains our approbation of that kind of utility, the utility of ambition for the person who possesses it. So can I just pause and see if you want to just say that I haven't got at what you're really asking about?
That was it. Yeah, you got it perfectly.
Oh.
And I guess you managed to answer it beautifully also. So thank you. Really.
Oh, sure.
Sorry to interrupt. We have only 5 more minutes, and Professor Lívia would like to ask a question.
Oh,
Please, por favor. Só um minutinho, Lívia. Só para falar para o pessoal que as perguntas que foram enviadas pelo chat do YouTube, nós vamos enviar para a professora Jacqueline Taylor, para ela tentar responder pelo próprio chat posteriormente. Só para... porque
is that right?
Professor Jackie, we have some questions on YouTube chat, and I'll send them to you, and then when we have another opportunity, if you could answer them.
Yes. Sure.
Yeah, but let's go, Lívia, please.
Because I'm not in the chat, I could not write it because I can't follow you both here and there. I'm sorry. Okay? Jackie, thank you very much. I don't think I'm afraid I won't give you enough to answer this question. But I do think I have the same puzzle that afflicted, something similar to what afflicted Marcus Balieiro. Because I'm looking not backward to the treatise, but forward to the 4 dissertations. And there, Hume is perfectly comfortable with the principle of sympathy in the passions and even in morals. So it doesn't seem to me that sympathy and the association of ideas has been at all abandoned by him, as we are led to believe by interpreters. And what puzzles me is that we can, your argumentation is perfectly and it's acceptable, it is beautiful if you tell us, I'm showing you what Hume has to say about utility and public interest in the second inquiry. But there is more to it in the book. because utility does not reduce to agreeableness. There is more to morals than utility. And the three apparitions of sympathy, the sympathy that leads to faction, is both here and treatise. The automatic sympathy that is the sympathy of balance is both here and in the treatise. And the sympathy that needs some exercise of imagination and of cognitive functions that is necessary for the moral point of view is both there and there. In section about justice. So sympathy is not absent from the second inquiry at all. And this descent of humanity is humanity comes from humane and inhumane. And in the 18th century, there is a sentimental taste in these words, in the usual exchanges in literature, in colloquial. You cannot simply transform the how do you say, the semantics of these words. And humane is one to one or one to some. It's not universal. It's very personal. So I do think that when you idealize, when you universalize the project, you rob it of some of the delightful particularities that allow Hume to deal with different cultures, with different situations, and different times, like our times, problems. How do you respond to that?
Thank you, Livia. There was a lot there. I agree with you that sympathy in the dissertation passions, yes, and association is still there. And I don't deny it. I mean, I don't say he abandons association, because he talks about association of ideas in relation to sympathy in the inquiry here. But he doesn't rely on that as the method, the methodology, the way he did in the treatise. So that's, I think it's not an abandoning of association so much as it is that methodology needs to be replaced with something that is more observation based, which is how do we react to things as useful or pernicious. But I'll just, I see what you're saying about you can't universalize this sense of humanity and at the same time accommodate different cultures and situations. And I would say to that, and I have written a little bit about it, but I would say that utility, just as utility, what I've suggested here is we can understand the useful in terms of my self-interested perspective, what would be useful to me now, a more partial perspective, whether that's me and my family, what's useful to us, or me and my political party, what's useful to us. And then this more social and universal party of humankind or shared moral perspective, where we have to strive, we have to have this other kind of language in order to talk to one another in ways that cross over the kinds of divisions that we otherwise find when we're just speaking from our own political party or particular party. But utility, so just as it utility can take different shapes depending on that perspective, it also, the utility of particular qualities of character, both that descriptive content and the merit of them, that utility is going to shift across different cultures, across different times. So one of the things that I find striking in the inquiry is Hume's acknowledgement of the, and really he's really seems to be taking the martial societies to task, ancient martial societies. So in section 7, when he's looking at courage and sublime and so on, I mean, he explicitly says, like, this is way too much for we moderns, the kind of ancient warrior culture, right? That martial societies are going to privilege. That's what's useful is, and Hume makes is courage and fortitude and that kind of thing. And Hume makes a reference there. Is it to Epictetus, where somebody who says you have to be on your guard against humanity. You've got to have a more stoic facade. So that kind of, right, Hume, it's the utility, what counts as a useful character trait, what the very content of that character trait is, can vary. I mean, the reference to Ulysses versus Fenelon, the 17th century, who Telemachus is his play, depicts courage very differently than Ulysses does, right? Because those kind of rough, rugged warriors that are, there's not really a kind bone in their bodies. So I think, so the humanity, it seems to be, and this idea of it as a drive, right? It's going to be realized in different ways, that the humanity is a tendency to come together and focus on what's really useful. And humanity may be tamped down in favor of some other principle of approbation. But I also wanted to say, right, that it can be a universal social principle, but that doesn't mean it responds in the same way across cultures.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Unfortunately, our time is over. So we have to finish now. I thank you again, Professor Jacqueline Taylor, for your presentation. Thank you for the questions, the brilliant answers. And, bom, pessoal, muito obrigada pela participação. Infelizmente, nosso tempo acabou. Nós vamos ter que ficar por aqui, mas em breve retornamos com mais uma apresentação, uma conferência, né? Então, nos vemos em breve. So, thank you again, and we see you soon.
Obrigada.
Obrigada, Jackie. Obrigada.
Obrigada again for the convite. It's such an honor to be part of Grupo Hume 20 years. So thank you so much. And I'll be here tomorrow. I'll be on the YouTube channel.
Oh, thank you.
Great.
We are going to, we will have lots of fun.
Yes, and Stephanie, if you could send me the chat from YouTube, I would really appreciate that. And yeah, and then I'll write in the chat tomorrow too.
Vinicius can send you the link to the because all participants can enter the room.
Yeah.
There is room for everybody.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Bye. Ciao.
Bye.
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 Ciao.
Ciao. Ciao.